Is Furina's Constellation 2 on the same level as Raiden and Nahida's Constellation 2s? The reason this Constellation 2 is so hyped to begin with is that it gives Furina a level of on-field play that is just upset at Constellation 0 level. People immediately associated this with what Raiden's Constellation 2 can do, since that Constellation makes Raiden an hypercarry of the maximum degree. Essentially, people were hoping this Constellation 2 would make Furina kind of an on-field carry like Neuvillette. In this video we'll explore why that isn't necessarily the case, but it's not a bad thing regardless. Let me remind you all that if you enjoy my content and my theory crafting, you can show your support by subscribing and leaving a thumbs up and also following me on Twitter. So before we talk about the actual Constellation 2, it's important to talk about the Constellation 1, because of course if you go for the Constellation 2 you'll get that as well. The interesting thing is that by itself, this Constellation 1 is insanely strong. It's pretty simple and straightforward as well, which makes it all the more consistent and powerful. Basically, if you have a Constellation 1, as soon as you use Furina's elemental burst, it will gain 150 stacks, which will immediately increase the damage bonus of the whole team by 30%. And also the Constellation 1 will naturally increase the upper limit of the burst stacks of Furina by 150. Basically, this Constellation gives Furina's elemental burst a floor of damage bonus that is on the level of Kazuha damage bonus buffing passive. It is quite a change of pace compared to previous Archons that had Constellation 1s that just felt like bridges to cross to get to the Constellation 2, which was the pride's reward. It is not like their Constellation 1s were completely useless, but they just felt infinitely inferior compared to what the Constellation 2s provided. On a team-wide scale, this extra bonus is around an 11% damage buff for the raw damage dealt. It is pretty great, because for comparison I put two versions of Neuvillette teams against the other, one with Constellation 1 Neuvillette and the other with Constellation 1 Furina, and the levels of damage were pretty equivalent. As a reminder, in case it provides the third stack, Neuvillette's Constellation 1 is pretty much a top 3 Constellation 1 in the game, behind Breeze's Constellation 1 and Huta's Constellation 1, just in terms of damage increase. So for Furina's to match it on a team-wide scale is pretty great, considering Furina is an off-field DPS that will fit on a lot of teams. The funny thing is that by itself, this Constellation 1 is not considerably below Nahida's Constellation 2, which is pretty crazy. Nahida's Constellation 2 is still better, of course, since it can achieve levels of team damage increase that range from 17% to close to 20%. So of course it's better, but it's still a Constellation 1 against a Constellation 2, so it's pretty great for Furina. In general, it seems that with Fontaine, MiHoYo is trying to partially move the power budget from Constellation 1 to Constellation 2. We've seen this with Neuvillette and Breeze, but also with Line, and now with Furina. So let's see what her Constellation 2 is about. Basically, if you have her Constellation 2, after you use her elemental skill, she will enter a stance for 10 seconds that will grant her Hydro Infusion and the increased HP multipliers for normal, charge and plunge attacks. Additionally, based on her current alignment, she will gain different effects, the alignment being the Usia or Numa things. If she is in Usia stance, which is the one where she gets the offensive pets from the elemental skill, she will also gain healing effects when she hits opponents with the Constellation 2. On the opposite, if she is in Numa stance, which is the one where she gets the healing pets, she will deal additional HP based damage with her normal charge and plunge attacks. So basically it's a trade-off kinda thing. It's important to remember that you can change her alignment dynamically by using her charge attack during her combos. And something even more important to remember is that her Constellation 2 will last just for 7 hits, which is what? 3 or 4 seconds of on-field time. Basically, instead of giving her an on-field carry type of window, it just gives her an extra window that is still more in line with other sub-DPS. For example, if you use Kazuha on a team and you use 2 of his elemental skills and a burst in a rotation, he will have a similar window as Furina Constellation 2 in terms of field time. So, in general, if you want to maximize the damage of the Constellation 2, it seems that going full Numa, so the effect that grants additional HP scaling on normal and charge and plunge attacks, is more favorable. It's true that you lose the damage of the pets during that window since the Numa stance has the healing pets, but overall it seems that it's better in terms of damage. Also, since each Numa hit will drain 1% HP from the whole team, it's also completely replacing the HP drain you get from the offensive pets, so it's just a full send offense version. What's interesting is that based on footage I've seen and opinions I've received, it seems that if you start in Usia stance while these Constellation 2 effects are active and you try to change the stance from Usia to Puma through the charge attacks, you will lose 2 stacks. I'm not totally sure why this is happening, but if I had to guess, it's because you both proc the healing effect from the Usia stance and also the HP scaling damage from the base effect. So basically, if you want to achieve the maximum amount of hits possible, the easiest way to do it is to just spam Usia or Numa hits. Furina starts in Usia stance, so if you want to spam Numa, you have to use a charge attack before you use the elemental skill. The truly interesting part about all of this though is figuring out how to best use this Constellation 2 on most teams actually. While this is extra damage for Furina obviously, it's not damage she will typically get by playing conventionally, and by conventionally I mean as she plays as Constellation 0. You see, the main difference with Radiant's Constellation 2 is that for the latter, this defense shred effect she gets at Constellation 2 is something that applies to her base playstyle. As such, this is basically a net damage increase that is always consistent on 99% of her teams. For Furina, the Constellation 2 is basically an extra window of field time that she doesn't have at Constellation 0, and as such it's a rotation extension. Now, this isn't necessarily always the case, because there are teams that play on longer rotations that they'd like to because of long cooldowns, so they have a lot of downtime. Downtime that can potentially be filled by Furina's Constellation 2 window, but for many other teams that is not the case. And to be honest with you, the damage this Constellation 2 is able to dish out doesn't seem to make this rotation extension worth it to me. It is not bad, it is perfectly in line with other characters' nukes that they get from their bursts, but it's just below the level of DPS Furina teams can achieve normally. Let's look at a new team with Furina again then. As you can see, this team can reach pretty absurd levels of damage, reaching even 80,000 DPS with Furina Constellation 1. From a DPS standpoint, for Furina's Constellation 2 window to be worth it here, it will also have to produce by itself a level of DPS that is close to 80,000, which is not the case here visibly. Now, at high investment levels, it's not always about DPS. It's more about how much damage you can deal and how fast you can deal it. With Furina's Constellation 2, you will be able to deal a lot of damage immediately, which can be useful, I guess. How useful, I don't know yet, because it's something you can only gauge in practice, but in general it has this kind of use case that it is worth to explore. You can also try to build a full team around Furina's damage, which isn't the worst actually. It is actually more about the Furina Yelan Kazuha core being extremely strong as a baseline than the Constellation 2 truly enabling things here, but it's still something you can build and it will feel kind of good in my opinion. But still, if you want to consider her in the hyper carry front load damage scenario, she starts competing with characters such as Ayaka, and it is not a great fight for her to pick, honestly. So basically, to me, this Constellation is more interesting in the outlook where you need to get immediate damage on a team where you also have another carry, and you can get it through Furina, so it's not bad. Compared to Constellation 0, her Constellation 2 builds are kind of different, because of course now you have a big chunk of your damage coming from normal and charge attacks, so bye bye Golden Troop I guess. Although it also kind of depends on the total rotation length, because the longer your rotation is, the more elemental skill procs you'll get. On the other hand, the Constellation 2 damage will not increase the longer the rotation is, since you will only get one window, so Golden Troop becomes better the longer the rotation is, basically. Remember that this is all still DPS talk, so it's not the full picture. If you care more about front load damage, then going for the Marashusei set is of course more convenient, since it maximizes the damage for that window. Of course, the weapon outlook also changes, with weapons that purely increase the elemental skill damage like Festering Desire losing steam, while of course consistent options like the Signature or Jade Cutter remain very strong. A great option that arises with Constellation 2 is of course the Black Sword, since its passive will buff normal and charge attack damage dealt by a big amount, so it just becomes much better here. An interesting option would be the Sacrificial Sword, since it can potentially allow her to use 2 elemental skills in a rotation, which allows her to use 2 Constellation 2 windows in a rotation, so it can extend her window and make it great. I'm not quite sure about how it stacks up to other weapons here in terms of total damage, but in teams that can use that second window, so teams that have a lot of downtime, and of course teams where Focalors is the carry, it seems pretty convenient actually. So overall, I would say Focalors constellations are pretty great. The Constellation 1 is incredibly good, the Constellation 2 is kind of niche, surely not broken, but still potentially useful. If you were dreaming about hypercarry Furina, sorry to disappoint ya, but it's probably not what MiHoYo was going for with the design of these constellations. But honestly, I'm pretty satisfied.